In the misty forests of Appalachia, where one night of rain can erase a whole town, a struggling veteran named Michael Harris built something people called madness. Tilted wooden walls, a hand-dug drainage trench, and a raised wooden bridge no one believed in. Neighbors mocked him. Some whispered the war had broken his mind. But why did Rocky, his German shepherd, bark every time they neared that soft patch of soil? What danger beneath the hillside was a K9 sensing long before humans could? And when the biggest flood in 30 years roared down the mountain, would Michael's crazy idea become the one thing that saved everyone? Before we begin, I hope your day is calm and safe. Tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country below, and if the story moves you, please subscribe to stay with us. A cool Appalachian mist drifted low across the mountain ridge, settling over Maple Hollow like a thin gray veil. The clouds hung heavy and close to the earth, the kind that carried a quiet warning of rain. The early air smelled of wet bark, old soil, and the breath of a land that never truly dried. Michael Harris paused on the ridge path, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth as he surveyed the valley below. His posture told a story long before his voice ever could. He stood straight out of habit, shoulders squared, but there was a subtle stiffness in the way he shifted his weight, a soreness earned from years of carrying heavy packs across unforgiving terrain. His face was lined in the way a man's face becomes lined not from age, but from things he has seen and tried to forget. His jaw was strong, defined by long months of silent determination, and a faint shadow of stubble covered his cheeks. His eyes were a deep brown, focused and watchful, always scanning, always anticipating something. They were the eyes of a man who had learned not to trust quiet places. Rocky trotted ahead of him, nose close to the ground. The German shepherd's coat was a black and tan blend, thick and slightly ruffled, especially around the neck where the fur grew dense. His ears stood high, twitching at each sound hidden in the forest. At 5 years old, Rocky still had the athletic build and alertness of a trained working dog, but there was also something softer in his gaze when he looked back at Michael, a steady loyalty that acted like a thread holding the man together. Michael reached the wooden shack he now called home. Perched halfway up the hillside, it looked almost too fragile for the mountain that held it. The roof panels were mismatched, some rescued from old barns, some hammered flat from discarded metal sheets. The walls leaned slightly inward, the mark of a structure built by a single pair of hands, desperate for shelter. A short set of steps led to the small front door. The top step cracked down the center. Just beneath the shack, the slope dipped sharply, and the ground bore scars of earlier washouts, long gouges in the earth where rain had carved its own path. He unlocked the door, the hinges creaking like an elderly man stretching his back. Inside, the room was small and practical. A cot pushed against the left wall, blankets folded neatly at the foot. A metal stove rested in the corner. A small table made from a repurposed cable spool stood near the window. Everything smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp wool. Rocky entered first, circling the room before settling near the cot. Michael exhaled slowly as he lowered himself onto a stool. The quiet inside the shack was a different kind of silence than the one he knew from the battlefield. This silence carried weight rather than threat. Yet he was not entirely at ease. His breathing slowed, but his mind remained awake, alert to memories that liked to surface in such calm. The war had carved its place in him. He had served in Afghanistan, often in terrain not unlike these mountains, where every step could hide danger. He remembered the echo of distant explosions, the crunch of gravel under tactical boots, the long nights when he waited for dawn that never seemed to come. And he remembered losing people, good people, the kind that didn't deserve to vanish into dust and metal. Sometimes, when the rain beat down on the roof of the shack, he would wake breathless, convinced he was back in a tent halfway around the world. Rocky would hear him long before Michael spoke. The dog would rise quietly and rest his warm head against Michael's arm until the shaking eased. Work kept his mind busy. Work kept the nightmares from growing claws. That morning, he had gone down into Maple Hollow, taking jobs as he always did. The townspeople saw him as the quiet handyman, a veteran with polite manners and a faraway stare. They respected him enough, but they didn't know him. Most didn't try. Earlier, he had run into Mrs. Evelyn Porter, an older widow who lived in a house with a sagging porch near the old creek road. She was short and round-shouldered, with soft gray curls that looked like smoke floating around her forehead. Her face was gentle, but her voice carried a firmness earned from raising 4 children on her own. She had asked if he could fix the loose shingles on her roof before the next rainstorm. He had agreed, not for the money, but because helping eased the ache in his chest. He had barely finished patching her roof when he met Jonah Pike, a tall man in his late 50s. Jonah looked like someone carved from mountain cedar, with long arms, rough skin, and a beard the color of cold ashes. His blue eyes were kind, but also marked by an exhaustion that came from struggling to keep his small farm alive. Jonah had asked for help clearing a clogged drainage ditch behind his barn. Michael had handled it silently, working beside the man until mud coated both their boots. Everyone needed something in Maple Hollow, but no one needed Michael. Not in the way that made a person feel they belonged. He sometimes wondered whether the war had taken that from him, the part of himself that connected easily to others. There were days he felt like a ghost, moving between bodies of work, fixing things that were broken while being unable to fix anything inside his own mind. Rocky nudged his hand gently, as if sensing that thought forming. Michael smiled faintly and scratched behind the dog's ear. "You're the only one who knows too much about me," he murmured. The wind shifted outside. A few raindrops tapped the roof in warning. Michael stood and approached the window, watching the clouds sink lower across the tree line. Rain here was not like rain in the cities. It arrived heavy, thick, often turning the mountain soil loose. He had seen landslides on this very slope. Small ones, but enough to make him step lightly each time he walked beyond the shack. He set a kettle onto the stove. As the water warmed, his mind drifted again to moments he wished he could erase. The blast that threw him to the ground, the dust in his lungs, the ringing in his ears that never fully left, the memory of Sergeant Collins shouting for cover. The way Rocky, then a lean and young K-9 unit, had dragged him out of that collapsed doorway. He owed the dog more than his life. Rocky had given him something to hold on to during the times he didn't think he deserved another breath. A soft rumble of thunder rolled through the valley. Rain, heavy by nightfall. He felt the familiar tension forming across his chest. Not fear exactly, but anticipation. The kind of anticipation that came from knowing weather could become enemy in seconds. Rocky stood and barked once, sharp and alert. Michael stepped outside, scanning the ridge. For now, Nothing moved but the mist, but he could sense the land preparing itself. The way the trees swayed, the way the ground seemed to breathe. He returned inside, shaking off the unease and focusing instead on the day's fatigue pulling at his muscles. He sat on the edge of the cot. Rocky lay beside him. As night settled over Maple Hollow, with distant thunder echoing through the valley, Michael closed his eyes. Rain began its soft drumming on the tin roof, and like so many nights before, Rocky kept watch. Maple Hollow lay cradled in a deep valley, a place where the mountains leaned inward as if trying to shelter the town, yet somehow ended up trapping it instead. From Michael Harris's shack halfway up the slope, the town appeared peaceful enough. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray ribbons. The clustered houses looked almost like toys, arranged neatly along the single road that twisted toward the old creek. But underneath that postcard stillness was a tension he felt in his bones every time another storm approached. The morning after the misty night, Michael walked with Rocky down the narrow dirt path that curved toward town. The ground felt spongy beneath his boots, not the firm, packed soil he preferred. Rocky stopped twice, ears forward, nose working overtime. The dog's tail stiffened each time, as if something beneath the earth whispered a warning only he could hear. Michael knelt beside him, brushing aside leaves to inspect the soil. Wet. Looser than yesterday. The kind of loose that had cost lives in other places, in other years. He stood and continued down the path. Maple Hollow slowly came alive around him as locals opened their shop doors and stepped onto porches. To most people, it was just another cloudy morning. To Michael, it was the kind of day that pretended to be harmless before turning vicious. He passed the old general store run by Leonard Briggs, who stood out front sweeping dust off the wooden steps. Leonard was in his late 60s, stocky, with a round face and a dense salt and pepper beard that covered half his neck. His eyes were watery blue and usually friendly, though this morning they carried the heavy tiredness of a man who'd lived through too many storms. Leonard nodded as Michael walked by. "Ground feels strange today," Leonard muttered. His voice was low and rumbling, the kind that sounded like it came from the earth. "Storm's building somewhere. You can smell it." Michael agreed quietly. Leonard had lived in Maple Hollow his whole life. He wasn't the type to exaggerate. Little by little, more townspeople appeared along the street. Among them was Amanda Reeve, a single mother in her 30s who worked at the diner. She was tall and thin, with long chestnut hair tied into a loose braid, and a face with gentle freckles scattered across her cheeks. She always had a soft smile, though her eyes betrayed constant fatigue from raising two energetic boys alone. She waved at Michael while carrying a stack of folded aprons inside. Michael stopped at the diner for a cup of coffee. Inside, warmth spread across the room from the old iron heater in the corner. The air smelled of biscuits, bacon grease, and freshly ground beans. Rocky curled beside his chair, resting his chin on his paws as if he'd memorized every inch of this place. As Michael sipped the bitter coffee, he overheard two men talking in the booth behind him. One was Curtis Mallon, a short, wiry man with sandy hair and a habit of rubbing the back of his neck when nervous. The other was Brent Holloway, a younger man in his late 20s with a square jaw, a trimmed beard, and hands scarred from years of mechanical work. "You hear that rumble last night?" Brent asked. "Not thunder. Something shifting up there." "Land does that," Curtis replied, though his voice wavered. especially with all the rain last week. Michael listened closely. They were noticing it too. The strange looseness in the mountain, the unpredictable shifts. In Afghanistan, before a hillside collapse or a hidden tunnel cave-in, he'd felt this same unsettling silence. He paid for his coffee and stepped back out into the street. A cool breeze drifted between houses, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of wet earth. He scanned the valley walls. The slopes loomed tall, draped in thick trees whose roots fought constantly to hold the soil together. But roots could only do so much in land that had been soaked for weeks. Rocky suddenly tensed. His ears pricked. His body stiffened with the alertness Michael knew well. The dog looked uphill toward the forested ridge. Michael followed his gaze. At first he saw nothing, then a faint shift. A thin line of soil near the tree line slid a few inches before stopping. It wasn't dramatic, but it was wrong. Very wrong. He crouched beside Rocky and whispered, "Good eyes, boy." The dog's gaze stayed fixed on the mountain as if he expected it to move again. Michael stood and walked toward the creek road. There he encountered Sheriff Raylan Doyle, a man built like an oak trunk with a thick brown mustache and a perpetually furrowed brow. Raylan was in his early 50s, with graying hair at the temples and a jaw shaped by years of chewing on decisions he never had enough deputies to enforce. His khaki uniform looked too tight across the shoulders, and the heavy leather belt seemed to weigh him down. "Morning, Harris," Raylan said. His tone was polite but carried the distance of a man too busy with trouble to worry about niceties. "Morning, Sheriff," Michael replied. Raylan pointed toward the ridge. "Had a report from a hunter. Said part of the slope shifted last night. You see anything up there near your place?" Michael nodded. "Ground's unstable. More than usual." The sheriff grunted. "Well, unstable is half this town's personality. The other half is stubborn. Unstable soil shouldn't be ignored." Raylan looked at him carefully, studying the conviction in Michael's tone. "You think it's serious?" "I think the land is trying to say something." Before Raylan could reply, a man stormed down the street shouting at a teenage boy who leaned beside the tool shop. This new man was Richard Bauer, known by most as Rick. He was tall but slightly hunched from years carrying heavy lumber. His hair was gray at the roots and unevenly cut, and he had a deep scar running along his left forearm from a chainsaw accident years earlier. Rick's temper was infamous, and today it showed. He yelled at the boy for accidentally splashing mud on his boots. The boy apologized repeatedly, but Rick kept shouting until Brent Holloway stepped in. "Leave him alone, Rick," Brent said, placing himself between them. "Mud dries. Your attitude might not." Rick grumbled and walked away, muttering curses. The boy thanked Brent before hurrying off. Michael had seen this dynamic too many times. The broken land created broken tempers, and broken tempers created broken people. But the mountain breaking was another matter entirely. By late afternoon, the clouds had thickened. A low hum vibrated through the valley. Michael recognized the vibration immediately. It was the same sensation he felt in Afghanistan before a major landslide triggered by airstrikes. The earth trembled in tiny warnings. Rocky pressed close to him, tail low, ears alert. Michael knew he had to check the upper ridge before nightfall. If the slope above his shack was weakening, the entire hillside could give way. He didn't want to imagine what would happen to Maple Hollow if tons of wet earth came crashing down. He climbed back up the slope with Rocky beside him. The air grew colder with elevation. Birds flew lower than usual. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. At the top of the ridge, he knelt again and examined the soil. It crumbled between his fingers, saturated to the breaking point. Loose soil, root structures slipping, water channels forming where none existed a month ago. Something wasn't right with this mountain. Rocky whined softly, nudging Michael's arm as if urging him to leave. Michael stood slowly, staring down at Maple Hollow. From up here, the town looked small, fragile, exposed. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the same feeling he used to get before an ambush, the sense of danger lurking, patient and silent. The land didn't need guns or explosions to kill. It only needed rain. As another rumble echoed across the valley, deeper this time, Michael placed a firm hand on Rocky's back. "We're not imagining it," he whispered. "Something's changing." Night began to fall. The air thickened with moisture, and in the gathering dark, Michael realized this was only the beginning. The rain returned before dawn, a steady drizzle that tapped along the roof of Michael Harris's shack like insistent fingers. The air outside was heavy, the kind that held moisture the way a sponge holds water before bursting. Rocky woke first, rising from his spot near the cot and pacing the small room, his claws clicking softly against the wooden boards. Michael sat up slowly, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and listened to the strange, uneven rhythm of the rain. Something in it felt wrong, too dense, too weighted, as if the clouds pressed down harder than they should. When he stepped outside, the smell of saturated earth struck him immediately. Rocky bounded ahead, nose twitching as he inspected the slope behind the shack. The sky was a muted blue-gray, the kind of morning that offered no sun, only a blending of shadows that made the mountain appear colder than it was. Michael walked to the edge of the narrow plateau where his shack sat and crouched beside Rocky. The dog growled low and steady at a patch of ground where the slope curved sharply downward. Michael leaned closer, pressing his palm into the soil. It shifted under his weight, unnervingly soft. A faint crack formed beneath his hand. Before he could react, a small section of earth broke free, sliding several feet down toward the stream below. Mud and stones tumbled with a choked hiss, leaving behind a raw, exposed scar in the hillside. Michael inhaled sharply. His shack stood only a few yards away. If the soil had given way farther up, he might not have survived the night. Rocky barked once, a sharp, urgent sound. Michael remained there for several seconds, feeling the tremor settle into his chest. This wasn't just erosion. It was the mountain signaling that its structure was unraveling, and if it continued, Maple Hollow would never stand a chance. He returned inside and pulled out a notebook from beneath the cot. The pages were worn from being carried through deserts and cities, full of sketches and ideas born from necessity. He turned to a blank page and drew quickly. A slanted barrier wall placed along high-risk slopes. A long ditch carved parallel to the incline to channel water away. And elevated footbridges connecting safe points, so people could escape rising floodwaters without sinking into mud or being swept away. It was crude, but it could work. He knew it could. He had seen similar structures in remote Afghan villages, where locals learned to redirect sudden torrents using nothing more than wood, stone, and determination. The difference was that in Afghanistan, the community had united to protect itself. Maple Hollow wasn't that kind of place yet. Still, he had to try. By midday, the rain stopped, and the clouds lightened. Michael headed into town with his notebook tucked under his arm, and Rocky following close. The dirt road glistened with puddles that reflected the gray sky. People were already gathered outside the community hall, a small wooden building with peeling white paint and 2 rattling windows. It doubled as a meeting place, a shelter during storms, and sometimes even a makeshift storage room when someone's roof gave out. Inside, townspeople sat on mismatched chairs while murmured conversations floated through the air. Leonard Briggs leaned against the wall near the front, chewing absently on a toothpick. Amanda Reeve sat near the window, tying her braid tighter as her sons whispered beside her. Sheriff Raylan Doyle stood near the podium with his hands on his belt, his expression unreadable. And then there was Earl Dawson. Earl was impossible to miss. A large man with broad shoulders, he carried the presence of someone who always expected others to make room when he walked through a doorway. His hair was thick and dark, parted in a sharp line. His beard trimmed close against a wide jaw. His eyes were small, always slightly squinting, and carried a cold arrogance earned from years of owning the largest lumber yard around. Earl was the kind of man who believed authority belonged to whoever shouted the loudest and owned the most property. His voice carried weight not because people respected him, but because they feared losing the work he provided. Earl spotted Michael and smirked. "Look who crawled down from the hillside." Michael ignored the remark and stepped forward. Raylan nodded for him to speak. Michael opened his notebook. The room quieted. "I've been tracking the ground movement on the ridge," he said, his voice steady despite the eyes on him. "The soil is shifting faster than normal. We're past the point where we can wait for help that isn't coming." Some heads nodded, others frowned. Earl folded his arms with exaggerated impatience. Michael continued. "I think we need a community system, something to redirect water and stabilize the slope. A series of flood barriers up high, drainage channels to carry the overflow safely around the town, and elevated paths so families can evacuate during flash floods." He held up the sketches. Amanda leaned forward slightly, squinting at the drawings. Leonard looked unsure. Curtis and Brent exchanged glances, but it was Earl's reaction that dominated the room. Earl let out a loud, disdainful laugh. "Redirect water? Build walls out of scrap wood? Dig ditches like we're in the Stone Age? You must be joking." He stepped closer, towering over Michael. "This your big idea, soldier?" Michael met his stare without flinching. "It could save lives. It could waste time," Earl snapped. "And time is something none of us have." Raylan rubbed his temple as if fighting a headache. "Let him finish, Earl." But Earl wasn't done. He turned to the townspeople. "You all know his story. Came back from the war with half his mind missing. Spends his days pacing slopes like he's hunting ghosts. You want to trust the valley's future to a man who jumps at thunder." Michael's jaw tightened. The old urge to shut down, to step back into silence, pulsed through him. He forced it down. Rocky stepped forward, standing beside him, hackles raised. Earl sneered at the dog. "I'm not asking for money," Michael said. "I'm asking for help. If we start now, we can build the first barrier before the next storm." Earl waved his hand dismissively. "The mountain's always been unstable. This year's no different. Stop scaring people." Leonard cleared his throat. Ground did seem odd lately. Earl turned on him. "So you'll believe the vet, but not your own eyes." The room fell silent. People looked at one another uncertainly. Fear of ridicule pulled their shoulders inward. Poverty and dependence on Earl's lumberwork kept their hands folded in their laps. Michael saw all of it, the uncertainty, the fear, the exhaustion, and he realized then that no argument he made today would shift them. Only the mountain would. He closed his notebook slowly. If no one wants to help, I'll build it myself. Earl rolled his eyes. Of course you will. Build your little toys. Just don't expect anyone to rescue you when they fall apart. No one spoke. No one moved. Rocky nudged Michael's hand gently, as if grounding him. To continue, to persist, to believe in what others couldn't see. Michael left the hall without another word. Outside, the clouds were gathering again, stacking themselves into dark layers. Rocky pressed against his leg, as if sensing the weight on his shoulders. The silence as they walked back up the slope was different from the silence of a quiet morning. It was heavy with something unseen. A warning, a promise, a choice. Michael tightened his grip on the notebook. If the mountain refused to wait, neither would he. Morning arrived with a cold wind sweeping down from the ridge, carrying the raw scent of wet bark and unsettled earth. Michael Harris stood at the edge of the slope behind his shack, the air pinching his cheeks as he studied the faint scar left by the small landslide days earlier. The ground still looked fragile, like something breathing shallowly under a heavy blanket of soil. Rocky sniffed along the edge, pushing his nose into patches of damp earth until he found one that made him recoil with a sharp bark. Michael knelt beside him. The soil shifted under just the slightest touch. He didn't need more warnings. The mountain was losing its strength. He straightened and carried his old shovel from the side of the shack. The handle was splintered, and the blade was dull and scratched, but it was the only tool he had. He thrust it into the earth and began digging the first drainage trench. Rocky stayed close, moving back and forth, occasionally tapping the ground with his paws. Whenever the dog felt the rumble of deeper movement, he barked twice in quick succession. Michael learned to pause immediately at that sound. It saved his life more than once throughout the day. The trench needed to follow the natural curve of the hillside, guiding water away from the town below. He dug slowly, methodically, lifting out clumps of mud that stuck to the metal blade. His arms burned. His back protested with every movement. Old injuries from Afghanistan, especially the one in his left knee, flared with sharp reminders of the weight he once carried for miles under blistering sun. But he kept digging. Around midday, the sound of footsteps approached. Michael paused and looked up to see a man named Harold Brimley trudging along the narrow path. Harold was a middle-aged local with a round face, thinning blonde hair, and a nervous way of blinking too often. He worked as a delivery hand for the lumberyard and always seemed caught between fear and indecision. He stopped near Michael and tugged at his coat collar. You might want to quit that, Harris," Harold said hesitantly. "Earl's not too happy with you stirring up ideas." Michael leaned on his shovel. "It's not ideas I'm stirring. It's mud." Harold shifted awkwardly. He said, he said you're making folks anxious, trying to frighten them with talk of floods and slopes sliding off. Said it'd be better if you left the land alone." Michael wiped sweat from his brow. "And what do you think?" Harold swallowed, eyes darting to the half-dug trench. "I think the ground's been strange lately. And I think Earl doesn't like anyone doing anything he didn't approve first. He paused. Just be careful. Michael nodded. Harold turned and hurried away as if afraid someone might see him talking too long to the wrong man. The warning didn't deter Michael. He kept going, carving the trench deeper, aligning it with the natural flow of runoff. When the sun finally dipped behind the ridge, he had carved nearly 40 feet of trench. His shoulders felt like they might tear apart, and his hands had blistered in several places. But it was a start. The next day, he walked deeper into the woods to find fallen trees that could serve as the framework for the flood barrier. Rocky led the way, trotting ahead with tail raised. They found several old trees, their trunks soft with age yet solid enough to stack. Michael cut them into sections using a rusted handsaw. Each pull of the blade sent jolts through his arms. Sawdust clung to his damp shirt. Birds scattered from the noise. When he finished, he tied the logs with rope and began dragging them uphill. Halfway back, Rocky growled and lunged toward a man standing near the trail. Michael pulled him back gently and recognized one of Earl Dawson's workers. The man was tall and lean, with a narrow face that always seemed twisted into a slight scowl. His hair was black, oily, and flattened beneath a worn cap. His name was Clyde Barker, a man known around town for having a mean streak he hid poorly behind silent glares. Clyde kicked a rock lazily. "Earl says you're making a mess of his forest. Says you're stealing trees for some fool project." Michael steadied his breathing. "I'm taking wood that's already fallen." "Doesn't matter," Clyde said. "My boss wants it gone." He stepped forward, kicked one of the logs hard, and sent it rolling back downhill. Rocky barked furiously, teeth bared. Clyde smirked. "Keep your mutt quiet." Michael pulled Rocky close. "Leave, Clyde. I don't have time for this." Clyde spat into the dirt and strutted away, but his parting words drifted back with the wind. "Earl said if you keep at this, he'll shut you down himself." Michael waited until Clyde vanished among the trees before he began retrieving the logs. It took twice as long with the slope working against him, but giving up was not an option. By afternoon, the logs lay in a small pile behind the shack. Rocky curled beside them, panting proudly, as if he too had helped move every piece. In the following days, Michael worked tirelessly. He dug more trenches, cut more wood, and carried stones in his arms until his muscles throbbed. He hammered stakes into the ground and erected the first angled barrier wall. Rocky's constant vigilance warned him whenever small tremors passed beneath their feet. It became a rhythm. Dig, lift, brace, pause for tremor, continue. But Earl Dawson refused to be ignored. One morning, Michael returned to the site and found sections of his barrier wall lying scattered. Logs torn apart, stakes yanked from the ground, footprints led off toward town. Rocky sniffed them and growled angrily, pacing in circles as if searching for the one responsible. Michael clenched his fists. He rebuilt the wall. Another day, as he hauled stones from the creek, he found the access path blocked. Several large branches had been deliberately placed across the trail. He dragged them aside one by one, sweat pouring from his forehead, breath heavy. When he reached the creek, he paused, hands trembling slightly. Earl was sending a message, and it wouldn't stop here. Later that week, he overheard two people whispering outside Leonard's store. They didn't see him approach. They spoke of Earl telling folks that Michael wasn't mentally stable, that the war had left cracks in his mind, that building trenches on a hillside was proof of it. One even said Earl claimed Rocky had been trained to attack people, making them dangerous neighbors. Michael stepped back into the shadows before they noticed him. A familiar tightness settled in his chest, the same feeling he had felt when rumors spread among soldiers who didn't understand his quiet nature. Isolation followed him like a shadow, no matter where he lived. Back on the slope, Rocky nudged him gently, sensing his unease. Michael knelt beside the dog and wrapped a hand around his strong neck. "It's just us, boy," he whispered. "But that's enough." As evening approached, thunder rumbled in the distance. Clouds gathered over the ridge, heavy and swollen. Rocky watched them with raised ears. Michael wiped dirt from his hands and looked at the barely finished trench, the half-built wall, the scattered tools. Exhaustion weighed on him like a pack he couldn't take off. His left knee pulsed sharply, and his back screamed with every breath. No one else would come. No one else would help. "But still," he said softly, "we have to do this. No one else will." Rocky pressed his head into Michael's arm, sealing the promise between them. And then they got back to work. By late October, Maple Hollow felt like it was holding its breath. The air clung thick to the skin, humid and restless, carrying the metallic scent of rain that had not yet fallen. For several days, dark clouds had circled the ridges like vultures waiting for the right moment to descend. Even the birds seemed uneasy, flying lower than usual, calling out warnings that no one fully understood. Michael Harris felt the tension long before the first drop fell. He had spent the day reinforcing the frames of his angled flood barriers, testing the stability of each trunk, making sure the trench was clear of obstructions. Rocky stayed glued to him the entire time, pacing tight circles whenever the ground shivered under their boots. The dog's instincts had saved Michael once before, and tonight they were more intense than ever. Rocky's ears stood rigid. His tail was stiff. Every muscle in his body looked ready to spring. The storm arrived without ceremony. A low groan echoed from the sky, followed by a sudden downpour that hammered the hillside. Rain pounded the shack roof like fists made of stone. Water raced down the slope, thickening into fast-moving streams that carved new channels in the soil. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the valley for brief, violent flashes. Michael couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his cot, listening, counting seconds between thunderclaps, watching the shadows tremble in the lamplight. Rocky paced the room, whining softly, his nails tapping the floor in frantic rhythm. Then it happened. A sound that didn't belong to wind or thunder. A deep, guttural roar that rose from the earth itself. Rocky froze, ears flattened, tail tucked. Then he lifted his head and let out a long, desperate howl that sliced through the storm. Michael stood up so quickly he nearly knocked over the lamp. "Rocky, what is it?" The dog ran to the door, scratched at it, barked sharply. Michael grabbed his flashlight and swung the door open. A tremor shook the ground, violent enough to send Michael stumbling. Outside, the rain fell so heavily it blurred the world into moving gray sheets. Trees swayed wildly. The soil beneath the shack vibrated like something alive. Then the mountain moved. A distant rumble rolled down from the upper ridge, followed by a terrifying crack. It sounded like the earth splitting apart. Michael saw a wall of mud and broken trees surging down a slope far above him, vanishing into the storm. The water in the creek roared louder, swelling with debris. Every instinct he possessed screamed that Maple Hollow was in danger. He turned to Rocky. "We need to go. Now." They ran into the night. The storm bit into Michael's skin like shards of ice. His flashlight beam trembled as he climbed down the slick path. The mud tried to pull his boots from under him. Rocky moved fearlessly, guiding him along the safest patches. Halfway down the mountain, they encountered their first sign of catastrophe. A collapsed shed lay in the middle of the path, its roof crushed under a fallen branch. Michael shone his light inside, but found no one. He kept moving. From the valley, he heard screams, real ones, not echoes from his memory. As he reached the base of the path, he saw chaos unfolding in Maple Hollow. Floodwater poured through the streets like a raging river. Houses built on low ground sat half submerged. People stood on porches, shouting for help, holding lanterns that flickered in the storm. Michael's jaw clenched. Earl Dawson's house was among the lowest in the valley. Rocky barked and darted toward the nearest home. The dog stopped at a narrow door half buried in mud, sniffing frantically before scratching at the wood. Michael stepped into thigh-deep water, pushed his shoulder against the door, and shoved it open. The inside was pitch black, except for the dim outline of a woman curled beside a toppled dresser, holding a small girl. The woman was Margaret Lewis, a seamstress in her 40s with short auburn hair often tucked behind her ears and pale, faintly freckled skin. Normally calm and warm, her face was now twisted with fear. "Please," she gasped, voice trembling. "It's my boy. He's upstairs. He can't hear well." Michael climbed the staircase, the wooden steps groaning under the weight of rising water. He found the boy, no more than 10, sitting on the bed, clutching a pillow. His hair was dark and tangled, his eyes wide in confusion. Michael lifted him up carefully. "It's okay. I've got you." Back downstairs, Rocky guided them toward the path Michael had carved earlier. The drainage trench, now full and rushing, carried part of the floodwater away, preventing it from rising even higher. The barrier wall diverted a second surge, splitting the torrent just enough to create a safe passage. He led the family up the slope. As soon as they reached higher ground, Rocky sprinted off again, nose to the wind. Michael didn't stop. He followed, boots slipping on soaked earth. They found an elderly man trapped against a fence, Thomas Miller, a retired blacksmith with white hair and a thick beard that hid most of his deeply lined face. His body, once powerful, had withered with age, and his legs trembled as the current pushed against him. Michael waded into the water and pulled the man to safety. Lightning lit the sky again. Rocky barked in another direction. They followed. The next house belonged to the Caldwell family. Their porch had collapsed, and the front door was jammed under debris. Inside, Michael heard frantic pounding. He used a stone to smash the doorframe and forced it open. 2 children huddled behind their father, a thin man in his 30s named Daniel Caldwell. Daniel had sharp cheekbones, short dark hair, and a weary determination carved permanently into his expression after losing his wife 2 years prior. Tonight, fear had replaced the usual steadiness in his eyes. "You came," Daniel said breathlessly. "Move," Michael replied. "We're heading uphill. Stay close." Water surged behind them as they fled. The creek overflowed, dragging branches, fence posts, and pieces of lumber with it. One of Michael's barriers caught a falling log, redirecting it just enough to keep the path clear. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. By now, more families followed behind, calling out to Michael for direction. Even through the storm, he heard someone yell that Earl Dawson and a group of families were trapped in the lowest part of the valley, the area closest to the creek. Michael's stomach churned. Earl had mocked him, spread lies, sabotaged his work. But none of that mattered now. Rocky sensed Michael's decision before he spoke. The dog bolted toward the lowest cluster of homes. Michael chased after him, water soaking through his clothes, mud dragging at his ankles. Earl Dawson's house was nearly underwater. The lights inside flickered erratically. People pounded on the windows. Michael smashed the glass with a rock. He crawled inside, grabbed a lantern, and led Earl's wife, a tall woman with long blonde hair tied into a tight bun, out first. 2 children clung to her skirt, crying. Earl himself was in the back room, his heavy frame wedged behind a fallen cabinet. His face, usually filled with smug certainty, now showed sheer panic. "Help me!" Earl shouted. Michael grabbed the cabinet and heaved. Pain shot up his spine. His arms burned, but the weight shifted enough for Earl to scramble free. Without a word, Michael pointed toward the path. "Follow the ditch. Do not stop." Earl didn't argue. They climbed. Water chased them but never overtook them. Every trench Michael had dug, every beam he had hammered into the hillside, gave the group a fighting chance. By the time they reached the higher ridge, more than a dozen people stood gasping on solid ground. Children sobbed. Mothers held them close. Earl fell to his knees, drenched and shaking. Michael wiped rain from his eyes. Rocky sat beside him, soaked but unwavering. Below them, Maple Hollow drowned in roaring water and collapsing earth. Yet a narrow line cut through the chaos where Michael's system had held firm. A fragile corridor through destruction. A passage that saved them. Wind screamed across Maple Hollow like a living thing, ripping through the valley with a force that bent tree branches and sent loose debris spinning in wild arcs. The roar of the flood still echoed through the night, a violent chorus of water colliding with earth. Michael Harris and Rocky had just guided a cluster of families up the hillside when another tremor shuddered through the ground. It was sharper this time, almost like a warning or a plea. Michael looked down the valley. Shadows moved rapidly between dim lantern lights and flashes of lightning. Families scrambling up toward higher ground, some crying, some calling out names lost in the storm. The rain poured so thickly it seemed to swallow sound, muffling everything except the relentless crash of the flood. Rocky suddenly stopped. He lifted his head, ears rigid, nose twitching through the wind. Then he bolted downslope without hesitation. "Rocky!" Michael yelled over the storm. But the German shepherd didn't look back. Something urgent had caught him. Something he could smell even through muddy water and smoke. Michael hesitated for a heartbeat. His muscles were screaming from exhaustion. His knee felt like it might split in half, and he knew the flood was still shifting, still looking for new paths to carve. But the look in Rocky's eyes right before he took off had been unmistakable. Someone was still down there. Michael grabbed his flashlight and ran. The slope was slick and treacherous, mud pulling at his boots like hands trying to hold him back. Twice he slipped, catching himself on exposed roots, feeling the ground tremble with every surge of water below. Thunder cracked overhead like artillery fire. Rocky's barks guided him through the blur of rain. When Michael reached the bottom of the path, he saw something moving near the main road of the valley. The water ran chest deep, ripping chunks of earth from the ground as it surged toward the creek. A large shape lay tilted at an angle, half submerged, wedged against a fallen tree. Lightning illuminated it briefly. A truck, a big one. Michael splashed through swirling currents to get closer. As he approached, he recognized the faded blue paint, the dented fender, the rust along the sides. Earl Dawson's truck. Rocky stood beside it, barking and lunging toward the underside of the vehicle. Michael shone his flashlight beneath the overturned edge. A figure. Trapped. Earl Dawson was pinned under the heavy steel frame, one arm jammed between the axle and the muddy ground. His face was pale and streaked with rain and dirt. His dark hair clung to his forehead. Mud covered half his cheek and jaw, making him look older, worn down. His normally sharp, arrogant eyes were wide with panic. "Michael!" Earl's voice cracked into a desperate rasp. "Help me! Please!" For a moment, everything froze around Michael. The storm, the water, the sound of collapsing barns and rushing debris. All he saw was Earl, the man who had publicly mocked him, sabotaged his work, spread lies behind his back, turned the town against him when all he tried to do was help. Earl Dawson, the man who wanted him gone, and now he was begging for help. Thunder rolled again. The water surged higher. The truck shifted slightly, grinding deeper into the mud. If it moved even a few more inches, Earl would be crushed. Rocky barked furiously, pushing his head under the truck, trying to reach Earl as if insisting there was no time for hesitation. Michael stepped into the freezing floodwater and knelt beside the truck. His flashlight flickered, shadows dancing across Earl's terrified face. "You should have listened," Michael said quietly. Earl shut his eyes as if bracing for the worst. I know I was wrong. I know I treated you like trash. But please don't leave me here." Rocky nudged the back of Michael's leg, whining, a desperate pleading sound he rarely made. Michael exhaled sharply. He couldn't abandon anyone. Not after everything he had seen in war. Not after all the nights he had spent wondering whether he could have saved more than he did. "Hold still," Michael said. He shoved his shoulder against the truck frame. The cold metal bit into his skin. The weight felt impossible, but he braced his feet and pushed with every ounce of strength he had left. The truck didn't budge. Rocky circled to the other side and dug furiously at the mud, trying to free Earl's arm. The dog's strong paws scraped away layers of wet soil, widening the gap. Michael pushed again, breath tearing from his lungs in short bursts. The truck shifted. Earl cried out as his arm came free, sliding out of the crushing pressure. Michael grabbed his collar and dragged him through the water, Rocky tugging at Earl's sleeve with his teeth, guiding him out of the danger zone. Only seconds after they pulled him clear, the truck gave way, collapsing fully into the mud with a violent splash. The spot where Earl had been trapped vanished under the weight of steel and water. Earl stared at the wreckage in disbelief. His chest heaved. His lips shook uncontrollably. For the first time since Michael had known him, the man looked truly human. Fragile, breakable, terrified. Michael helped him sit under the remains of a fallen porch roof that provided slight cover from the rain. Earl's breath rattled as he tried to speak. I thought I was going to die." "You almost did," Michael said. Rocky pressed himself against Earl's side, offering warmth and grounding the man in reality. Earl looked down at the dog with disbelief, then wiped his face with trembling fingers. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "Not from either of you." Michael didn't answer. He just checked Earl's arm for injuries. It was badly bruised but functional. When Earl finally found his voice again, it cracked raw. "I was wrong about you," he said. "I mocked you. I tried to stop you. I let my pride blind me. And you still came for me." Michael shook his head. "Rocky went first. I just followed." Earl turned to Rocky, tears blurred in his eyes, mixing with rain. "Good boy. I don't deserve what you did." Rocky simply licked Earl's wrist. A distant shout cut through the storm. Families were calling out for Michael, guiding groups up toward the ridge. The danger wasn't over. The valley still flooded. More people needed help. Michael stood and pulled Earl to his feet. "Can you walk?" Earl nodded shakily. "Then let's move." Rocky ran ahead, splashing through the water, barking to signal the path forward. Earl followed behind Michael, limping but determined. As they climbed toward safety, Earl spoke again, voice soft but full of meaning. "When this is over, I'll make things right. I swear it." Michael didn't respond. Promises made in storms sometimes vanished when the skies cleared. But Rocky looked back, his amber eyes fixed on Earl with something almost like approval. And somehow, in the darkest night Maple Hollow had ever seen, that small gesture meant the world. Dawn arrived slowly, dragging a pale gray light across Maple Hollow, as if the sun itself was unsure whether it wanted to witness the destruction below. The storm had passed hours earlier, leaving the valley wounded and gasping. A heavy mist floated above the soaked earth, carrying the scent of splintered wood, wet soil, and a faint bitterness from the river that had swallowed half the town. Michael Harris stood near the ridge, hands on his knees, chest still rising sharply with exhaustion. Rocky sat beside him, panting but alert, his fur matted with mud and rain. They had guided dozens to safety, but the night had felt endless, like moving through a nightmare that refused to let up. When the mist finally thinned, the full devastation revealed itself. Maple Hollow was nearly unrecognizable. Houses built close to the stream had vanished entirely, dragged from their foundations. Barns lay ripped open, roofs peeled back like cracked shells. The once familiar dirt road that wound through the center of town had been erased, replaced by a river of debris. A toppled wagon lay half buried in mud. A chicken coop drifted in slow circles at the edge of a broken fence. Smoke rose from a chimney that somehow remained intact, thin and wavering. But amidst the chaos, one section of the valley stood firm. The trench Michael had dug cut a clean path along the slope, carrying water away even now. The barrier wall still angled proudly against the hillside, directing the flow into safer channels, and the elevated wooden walkway stretched like a lifeline across part of the ridge, its planks battered but holding strong. Michael had not built a miracle, but he had built just enough. He watched as survivors gathered on the high ground, some sitting on wet grass, others clinging to one another as the full weight of the night settled in. Children cried softly. Adults stared blankly at the shattered homes below. Shock had drained their voices. It was the kind of silence Michael recognized from battlefields. The stunned quiet that came after chaos finally loosened its grip. Rocky nudged Michael's leg. Michael placed a hand on the dog's head, feeling the warmth beneath the soaked fur. We keep moving, he whispered. They still need help. They descended the slope slowly. Michael checked injured ankles, wrapped cuts, and guided families to a flatter area where the ground was safer, while Rocky moved from group to group, allowing frightened children to hug him and staying close to anyone shaking from cold or fear. The German shepherd seemed to understand that today his job was not warning, but healing. A cluster of townspeople stood near the collapsed remains of the community hall. Among them was Anna Briggs, a kind woman in her late 30s with curly dark brown hair and soft brown eyes. Anna had always been known for her calm presence and gentle voice, the kind that soothed crying babies and eased tension at town meetings. Now she stood with her arms wrapped around two young neighbors, both trembling. When she saw Michael, her expression shifted. Grief softened into gratitude. She approached him, her boots sinking into the mud with each step. "You saved us," she said, voice rough with emotion. "You saved all of us." Michael shook his head. "Rocky saved half this valley." Anna reached down and scratched Rocky behind the ears, and Rocky leaned into her touch. "Then we owe both of you our lives." Nearby, an older man with broad shoulders and close-cropped gray hair approached. His name was Sheriff Donovan Pike, a stern figure in his 50s with deep lines carved into his forehead from years of dealing with trouble far larger than his small town. Donovan was not a man easily rattled, but last night aged him further. His brown eyes were bloodshot, and his uniform jacket was torn at the sleeve. He stopped in front of Michael. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Donovan extended his hand. "I misjudged you," the sheriff said quietly. "We all did. If you hadn't built those defenses," his voice cracked, but he caught it, "there'd be bodies in this mud right now." Michael hesitated before shaking Donovan's hand. The sheriff gave a firm nod, then returned to helping survivors. More townspeople gathered, forming a loose semicircle as if waiting for direction. Among them was Brent Holloway, a local mechanic with grease permanently embedded in his fingernails and a permanent scowl etched into his square jaw. Brent was tall, broad, and known for being blunt to the point of rudeness, but today his shoulders sagged. Behind him stood his younger sister, a petite woman with light brown hair and a timid expression. Brent usually shielded her from everything, but he seemed unsure how to shield her from what they now saw. Brent looked at Michael. "That trench, that wall, I didn't think they'd do anything." His voice lowered, softer than usual. "But they saved my sister. And me." Before Michael could respond, screams echoed from the lower end of the ridge. People split apart as Earl Dawson limped forward, mud streaking down his pants, his shirt torn and soaked. His face was pale and strained from the night's ordeal. His large frame, usually imposing, looked smaller somehow, weighed down by guilt. Earl stopped in front of the gathered crowd. His breath came hard and uneven, but he forced himself to stand upright. Michael felt Rocky shift beside him, watching Earl with careful curiosity rather than hostility. Earl ran a trembling hand through his wet hair. Then he dropped to both knees in the mud. A gasp rippled through the crowd. "I owe this man my life," Earl said, his voice breaking. "And all of you owe him yours too." No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to pause. Earl swallowed hard, shoulders shaking. "I mocked him. I dismissed him. I destroyed the work he tried to build. And still, when the storm came, he didn't hesitate." His eyes found Michael's. "You came for me." You should have left me there. You would have been justified. Tears slipped down Earl's cheeks. But you didn't. A murmur spread among the people, soft but growing. Earl pushed himself to his feet. Mud clung to his knees like stains he couldn't wash away. We can't undo the storm, but we can rebuild this valley. Together. He pointed at the trench, the barriers, and the walkway. These structures saved us. If we want a future here, we follow his lead. Michael stepped back slightly, uncomfortable with the attention. He had never expected praise. He had asked only to be heard. To his surprise, Brent Holloway stepped forward. Then Anna, then Sheriff Donovan. One by one, the survivors voiced their agreement. A tall, wiry man named Jesse Kane approached next. Jesse was a woodworker in his late 40s, with sun-tanned skin and long, dark hair tied into a low ponytail. He rarely spoke during meetings, preferring to listen from the back of the room. But today, his sharp, hazel eyes were filled with resolve. "Your design is smart," Jesse said. "Better than anything we've done ourselves. If you show us how, we'll build more of those walls. Bigger ones, stronger ones." Another voice chimed in. "We can widen the trench, dig more channels." It was Margaret Lewis, looking steadier than she had last night, her auburn hair plastered against her cheeks. Others joined. "We'll bring tools. We'll gather lumber. We'll help clear debris." Michael felt something shift inside him, a warmth he wasn't prepared for. Belonging was a powerful thing. He had not felt it since before the war. Earl lifted his chin and addressed the group once more. "From this day forward, we build the Maple Hollow Community Shield, together, stronger than before, and Michael Harris leads the effort." The crowd erupted into agreement. Not cheers. Those would come later. This was something deeper, a vow forged in the mud of shared survival. Michael looked down at Rocky. The dog's tail wagged once, slow and sure, as if saying, "You did it. They finally see you." Michael cleared his throat. "All right," he said. "If we're doing this, we start today." And just like that, Maple Hollow began to awaken, not from sleep, but from years of fear, doubt, and division. Spring returned to Maple Hollow, not with the usual shy sunlight of the mountains, but with a sense of renewal that seemed almost defiant. Small buds pushed through mud-darkened soil, birds rebuilt nests in the remaining pine trees, and the air carried the faint sweetness of new grass. For the first time in many months, the valley felt alive again. Not whole, not healed yet, but breathing. Michael Harris stood at the ridge overlooking the town, now less a ruin and more a worksite filled with determined people. He wore a simple cotton shirt, sleeves rolled up, a tool belt hanging loosely at his waist. His face, once hardened by years of battle and weeks of isolation, now carried a quiet steadiness. His beard had grown slightly longer, peppered with more gray than before, and the lines around his eyes seemed to hold purpose rather than fatigue. Rocky sat beside him, fur clean for the first time in weeks, the morning light catching the tan patches on his coat. His ears were up, tail wagging lazily. The dog surveyed the valley with the expression of a watchman satisfied with progress but not letting down his guard. Below them, Maple Hollow buzzed like a hive. Families moved in coordinated groups, carrying stones, shovels, and lumber. Children ran up and down the slope with buckets of smaller rocks, proud to play even a tiny role. Older residents sat on overturned crates, directing people with the precision of seasoned commanders. The project was massive, much bigger than anything the town had attempted before. But the storm had forged unity, and now that unity refused to fade. Michael descended the slope as two men approached, each carrying long planks on their shoulders. One was Jesse Kane, the woodworker with sun-dark skin and calm hazel eyes. Sweat glistened on his forehead, his long ponytail sticking to his neck. The other was a newcomer, Caleb Rowan, a mason from the next town over, who had arrived a week prior after hearing of Maple Hollow's disaster. Caleb was tall and broad-shouldered, with sandy blonde hair and a full beard trimmed neatly along a square jaw. His blue eyes held a gentle intelligence, and he spoke with a soft drawl that put people at ease. "Morning, Michael," Caleb said, shifting the planks to one arm. "We're setting the first line of stones today. Your trench design lines up real nice with the natural runoff. Never seen something this clever built by one man." Michael shook his head. "Wasn't one man. Rocky helped." Caleb chuckled. "Then the dog's a better engineer than half the folks I've worked with." Rocky barked once, proud. As the men continued toward the work site, Michael joined Anna Briggs, who was kneeling beside a stack of stones. She was marking them with chalk, her curly brown hair pulled into a messy bun. Her warm brown eyes lifted when she saw him. "We're nearly ready to lay the first wall," she said. "Sheriff Donovan is gathering a crew to dig the foundation." Michael knelt beside her, running his hand over one of the stones. "Feels strange," he admitted. "Building something meant to last." Anna smiled gently. "After what you built last fall, I trust this just as much." Nearby, Donovan Pike barked instructions to three younger men. The sheriff looked healthier now that the crisis had passed, still stern, still carrying himself with authority, but with a new ease in his shoulders. His gray hair caught the sunlight as he pushed a wheelbarrow into place. "Move that gravel there." "No, not there, son. You'll choke the runoff flow." "Think like water," Donovan said, waving his arm as though sculpting the flow himself. Michael couldn't help but grin slightly. Donovan acted as if the entire project had been his idea. By mid-morning, the main trench had doubled in width. With Caleb's help, they lined the sides with stones, anchoring them with mud and gravel. The new walls were taller, curving slightly inward to resist pressure during heavy rainfall. Jesse hammered wooden posts into the ground with rhythmic precision, his arms steady and powerful. Children watched with fascination as the men formed the structure. One little girl, barely tall enough to see over the pile of rocks, tugged on Michael's sleeve. She had bright red hair tied with a yellow ribbon and a sprinkle of freckles across her nose. "Mr. Harris," she said shyly, "my mama said Rocky saved me, but I think you saved Rocky too. I just wanted to say thank you." Michael felt warmth spread across his chest. "You're welcome," he said, "but Rocky deserves most of the credit." Rocky trotted over and nudged the girl's hand, accepting her praise with noble restraint. As the days passed, the transformation accelerated. People rebuilt not only homes but relationships. Brent Holloway repaired the engine of a neighbor's tractor free of charge. Margaret Lewis organized a communal kitchen under a canvas shelter to feed volunteers working long hours. Daniel Caldwell, often quiet and withdrawn, brought bundles of firewood every morning, his sharp cheekbones softening whenever Michael greeted him. Even Earl Dawson appeared every morning at sunrise, never arriving empty-handed. His once immaculate clothes were replaced with work overalls. His dark beard grew uneven. His eyes carried humility instead of superiority. The guilt of his past actions weighed on him, yet he showed up day after day, hauling stones, cutting lumber, or helping Caleb with masonry. On the third week of construction, Earl approached Michael as they stood overlooking the widening trench. "I talked to the county council," Earl said, scratching the back of his neck. "Told them I'd be donating half the lumber we need, no cost. And I recommended they appoint you as project lead officially." Michael blinked. "Earl, No," Earl interrupted. "Let me finish. I owe you more than I can repay. Let me do this right." Michael studied him. The man who once sneered down at him now stood with shoulders slightly hunched, waiting for acceptance. Rocky sniffed Earl's boots thoughtfully before sitting beside them, a gesture Earl took as approval. His eyes softened. They worked until late spring. When the final section of the elevated walkway was bolted in place and the last stone wall stood firm along the hill, Maple Hollow gathered at the foot of the slope for the official unveiling. The sun cast golden light across the valley, illuminating the rebuilt homes, the repaired fences, and the field of new saplings planted to prevent erosion. A small wooden sign had been erected beside the main trench. Letters carved by Jesse Kane read, "Harris Rocky Floodway, in honor of the man and the dog who refused to stand alone." Michael stood stiffly, embarrassed. A man who spent most of his life unnoticed wasn't prepared for recognition. But Rocky sat proudly at his side, chest lifted, tail swaying like a flag. As the townspeople quieted, Donovan nudged Michael forward. Michael cleared his throat. His voice carried a softness that stilled the crowd. "I never meant to build something for praise," he said. "All I wanted was to keep people alive in a place that can be unforgiving. But Rocky, he taught me something I didn't learn in the army, something I didn't understand until this town showed it to me." He looked down at his loyal companion. Rocky met his eyes with warmth and assurance. "No one is strong alone," Michael continued. "But together, we can build things that last far longer than fear." The crowd erupted in applause. Some cried. Children ran to Rocky, hugging him. Michael felt his vision mist as he realized the truth. Maple Hollow was not just rebuilding the town. They were rebuilding him, too. That summer, the community presented Michael with a new house on the hill, built by dozens of hands. Rocky received a ceremonial collar with a small copper tag that read, "Guardian of Maple Hollow." Every evening the dog lay on the porch, keeping watch over the valley he helped save. And in the years that followed, not a single life was lost during flood season. Because one veteran dared to try, and one dog refused to let him stand alone. In the end, Michael Harris and his loyal dog Rocky proved that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, and built one shovel of earth at a time. Maple Hollow survived not because of strength or wealth, but because compassion flowed stronger than the flood. The town rose again when people chose unity over fear, forgiveness over pride, and hope over despair. Michael's journey reminds us that even the smallest acts, one trench, one warning bark, one hand reaching into a storm, can save lives and change destinies. And perhaps, somewhere in the rain and the mud and the rebuilding, there was a touch of something greater, a hint of protection, a whisper of grace, a reminder that God often works through ordinary people doing extraordinary things. As you finish this story, may His blessings rest on you and your loved ones. If this tale touched your heart, please share it, drop a comment, subscribe to the channel, and keep the spirit of kindness alive in your daily life. May God watch over you, guide your steps, and bring light to every storm you face.